I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's June 11th, and we have a lot to talk about. Just a couple of weeks ago, thousands of physicians, nurses, physicians' assistants, rehabilitation specialists, and others traveled to Nashville to attend the Consortium of Multiple Sclerosis Centers' 38th annual meeting. Welcome to part 2 of my coverage from that meeting. If you missed last week's podcast episode, I'm going to recommend that you listen to that episode, that's episode number 353, before listening to this episode. I think you'll find some great stuff in last week's episode, and you'll find a link to that episode in today's show notes. One of the reasons that I look forward to meetings like this one is they give me an opportunity to have in-person conversations with some of the people who, through their work, are making a real difference and improving the lives of people living with MS. Today, we're going to hear some of those conversations. The Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting, or CMSC as it's more commonly known, kicked off with a presentation jointly hosted by the Consortium of MS Centers and the National MS Society. The presentation was titled, Bridging the Gap to Early Support in MS. After the presentation, I sat down for a quick conversation with the National MS Society's Executive Vice President for Advocacy and Healthcare Access, Bari Talente. I'm here at the Consortium of Multiple Sclerosis Centers annual meeting. The very first event, the kickoff event, was a symposium that was put on by CMSC and the National MS Society. It was entitled Bridging the Gap to Early Support in MS. And I'm talking with Bari Talente, the Executive Vice President of Advocacy and Healthcare Access, the National MS Society. Good to see you again, Bari.
Nice to see you, John, and in person this time. I love it.
That's right. This is really a treat. As I was just having a conversation with Bari a moment ago, this was a very impressive presentation for so many different reasons. But I wanted to talk a little bit about getting that early support first. Why is getting early support in MS so important?
Well, we've heard for so long that MS can be a very isolating disease. And part of that is the age of diagnosis. Part of it is the invisible symptoms that can make it harder for people around you to understand what you're going through. And so being able to connect early and get, some kind of understanding of other people's experiences with MS, but also just that human connection to be able to connect with someone who's going through the same thing that you're going through. And then to make sure that you're as informed as works for you to help you make decisions around your MS. And that's where the National MS Society can really come in facilitating those early peer connections, but also making sure that people have that information as they're ready for it to help make decisions.
And having access to that kind of information is particularly important if you're in an area that doesn't have a lot of MS specialists at hand to be able to provide it to you. One of the things you talked about today was the Neurological Desert Mapping Project, which I found fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Absolutely. So we partnered with Deloitte on our neurology desert mapping. And really what it does is it looks across the country and identifies areas where people don't have access to either a general neurologist or an MS specialist. And there's some definitions that go into that focus in on how many neurologists there are, neurologist density, as well as spatial access, which includes both driving time and driving distance to someone who's knowledgeable about MS, essentially. Because really being able to connect with someone who's knowledgeable about MS as a healthcare provider is going to give someone more of the information and resources they need to make good decisions and along their journey with MS.
So talk a little bit about how the National MS Society is going to be using this information.
Right. Well, we really view it as an equity issue as well, because every person with MS should benefit from a cure, and every person with MS, as we're working towards the cure, should have access to high quality healthcare. And that means a healthcare provider who's knowledgeable about MS. And so when we see these desert areas, then we know that there's work we have to do to make sure that we can grow the knowledge of healthcare providers who are there on the ground to facilitate connections between those healthcare professionals who are in some of these desert areas to MS specialists so they can get that expertise connection. And we also want to leverage the existing resources that are in communities, like community health workers and safety net institutions that are seeing people with MS already, and make sure that those providers have the information that can connect people with the National MS Society to help them get what they need. And also so those people on the ground have increased knowledge and awareness of MS to support people.
In terms of being able to provide information to general neurologists and even primary care physicians in some of these areas, another project that was mentioned was Project ECHO. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, ECHO MS is a telespoke learning model that has hub and spokes. And so the hubs are MS centers or MS specialists with lots of experience in MS. And then the spokes are those often community-based providers, whether it's a general neurologist or a primary care provider. It may be an MS specialist in some fields that just sort of wants that extra connection. There's a curriculum that goes along with ECHO MS, but really the base of it is that opportunity to connect and learn, share experiences, and really talk through challenges in treating people with MS. And it's a 6-month program in the Care Essentials, and it's really a way to grow that knowledge and expertise and also increase connections. So even when providers leave the ECHO MS program, they have a network of people to turn to really, if they come up with those difficult cases of MS and have questions to ask or want to talk through it. So there's that knowledge piece and also that connection piece.
And that becomes really important. One of the things that was brought up in today's presentation was a global survey by the MS International Federation, where they identified barriers to early care, early diagnosis, early treatment. And the second largest barrier was lack of awareness of MS symptoms among healthcare providers. So this kind of a program really is, it targets and solves that issue, doesn't it?
It certainly helps with it. And I think if you think about some of those early symptoms of MS, they can be more vague and less clear about what's going on. And so it's likely that the first healthcare professional someone who has yet to be diagnosed encounters is a primary care provider, right? They may have fatigue, they may have tingling or numbness. They're going to go talk to a primary care provider about what's happening in their body. Maybe they get to a general neurologist, but we have to get to earlier diagnosis. We have to make sure that we're getting to those healthcare professionals that are seeing people really early in their MS journey.
Well, as I said, I couldn't think of a better way to kick off the next 3 days here at the CMSC annual meeting than with this symposium. I just thought it was really full of great information, well presented. And so thank you and the Society for that. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Great. Well, thanks, John. It's always a pleasure.
The featured speaker during this early morning event was Dr. Nancy Sicotte, who stressed the importance of early diagnosis and treatment for MS. I had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Sicotte about why early diagnosis makes a real difference in patient outcomes. So we're at the Consortium of Multiple Sclerosis Centers annual meeting. It kicked off with a symposium entitled Bridging the Gap to Early Support in MS. And I'm speaking with Dr. Nancy Sicotte. Dr. Sicotte is the chair of the Department of Neurology and the founder and director of the Neuroimmunology and Multiple Sclerosis program at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. Good to see you again, Dr. Sicotte.
Great to see you, John. Happy to be here.
Since we're talking about bridging the gap to early support, why is early diagnosis early intervention so important in MS?
Well, thanks for that, John. I think it is one of the most important things that we've learned about the journey that people live with when they're diagnosed with MS. And that is, the sooner the diagnosis is made, the sooner that we can get people on effective therapies, the better their journey will be and the better their outcomes will be. And we've learned that through many years now of monitoring patients off or on medication. And also, I think the other piece to think about is the psychological part of getting an early answer when people are living with symptoms that are confusing or that they're worried about. I think that's also part of the early recognition that's important.
So to that point about the peace of mind somebody gets once the symptoms they're experiencing can actually be identified and diagnosed. One of the things that was shown today was some statistics from the MS International Federation, and they showed that the biggest barrier to early treatment was a lack of awareness about MS symptoms from the general public. So somebody may be experiencing blurry vision or some numbness and tingling or something, but they don't necessarily connect that. How can we find ways to sort of raise the public IQ about multiple sclerosis?
So this is a great question, and I think that we can look to our colleagues in other neurological conditions for guidance. So for example, in the stroke world, they have developed algorithms and TikTok videos to help people understand what they should be looking for, what are warning signs of a stroke. So in MS, we don't have as much of a acuity issue, but we could also do, and have been talking about doing similar kinds of campaigns so that people can recognize things that are quite suggestive of MS. For example, you said blurry vision, and having numbness in both legs, having double vision, especially if it's a young person who has no other kinds of risk factors. So I think we need to raise the awareness among patients, but we also need to raise the awareness among primary care physicians, even emergency room physicians, and also the fact that our patient population is a lot more diverse than people may have recognized, so that they have to not come in with a pre-test probability that says, oh, this couldn't possibly be MS because it's not a young woman who is white. I think that will also help to raise awareness.
The second biggest barrier to early diagnosis, pointed out by the MS International Federation, was a lack of awareness of MS symptoms among healthcare professionals. That was a global survey that the MSIF did, but it was interesting because here in this room, there was an audience poll taken real time asking a couple of hundred healthcare professionals what sorts of symptoms are typically misdiagnosed when someone comes in. And the symptoms that I saw leading that sort of real-time survey were fatigue, tingling, numbness, gait issues. These are very typical of multiple sclerosis. So how do we improve the awareness, raise the awareness in the healthcare professionals to understand that this is someone who I may want to refer for further testing?
So I think that demonstrates one of the big challenges, the fact that the symptoms that came to the fore there when we did the survey, which was fascinating, fatigue was number one and numbness was number two. So the issue is those are fairly non-specific. If you're a physician and you have a patient that comes to see you and they complain about fatigue, especially if you're a primary care physician, your mind is not going to go first to MS. That's not going to be top of the list. There's a lot of other conditions that fatigue is a part of. So I think it requires some awareness that these symptoms will cluster together, and really getting a better history from the patient in terms of when they're experiencing them, things like heat sensitivity, and there are other sort of subtle factors that could help. But I do think it raises or it illustrates the challenge that we have, because some of these early symptoms are very nonspecific. And as we talked about during today's session, we want to balance this awareness with not, putting people through a lot of testing who probably don't need it. Because on the other end of that spectrum, we have the misdiagnosis problem where people have some nonspecific symptoms, they have a scan done, they don't want to have a lumbar puncture, which is more specific, and they have maybe some little spots, but it's not uncommon that people can have changes on their MRI that are non-specific and not related to MS, but the radiologist puts that in the differential, and lo and behold, the patient gets diagnosed and started on a disease-modifying therapy. So we have to kind of balance both sides of that coin and thread that needle, which is challenging.
You mentioned that whether it's an MRI or a lumbar puncture, these are complex procedures and not something everybody necessarily needs to rush into. So if I can polish off my crystal ball for just a moment, how will the nature of MS diagnosis change, and what might that mean for MS treatment down the line when we may have a blood test that will provide real answers?
Well, I think this is what's so exciting, is that we're moving forward, and we have some great data and some changes coming, which I think you're aware of, which will be presented at the ECTRIMS meeting. So we're making a lot of progress on biomarkers, both imaging biomarkers, which we're very much involved in, as well as blood-based biomarkers, as you said. And I see in the future that we're going to be able to deploy both of those and really help us to make an accurate early diagnosis, but also prognosticate and help guide therapy, for example. So I think there's a lot of excitement about the advances that have been made in both of those areas.
Well, this symposium kicked off the entire next 3 days of meetings and presentations. I couldn't think of a better way to kick it off. Thank you for your presentation, and thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure. Enjoy the meeting.
Later that morning, I listened as the Assistant Director of the Center for Neuropsychology and Neuroscience Research at Kessler Foundation, Dr. Brian Sandroff, posed the question, does exercise improve cognitive functioning in multiple sclerosis? Following Dr. Sandroff's presentation, we talked about that question. I'm at the Consortium of Multiple Sclerosis Centers annual meeting, and I'm here with Dr. Brian Sandroff. Dr. Sandroff is the Assistant Director of the Center for Neuropsychology and Neuroscience Research at Kessler Foundation, and I sat in on his presentation earlier today, and the title of that presentation was, Does Exercise Improve Cognitive Functioning in MS? And so my question, Dr. Sandroff, is, does exercise improve cognitive functioning in MS?
That is the big question. Thanks, John. It's difficult to answer that question in a very straightforward manner. There's some evidence to suggest that, exercise very well could improve cognition in MS. And there's also some evidence to suggest that it doesn't do such a good job of improving cognition. But throughout the years, what we've been trying to figure out is how to design our studies the right way so that we can answer the question in a better, more straightforward, efficient capacity, and to really develop our hypotheses for why we think exercise might improve cognition in MS. As if we have a good research question, a good hypothesis, and a strong study design, the hope is that we'll get some really good data that really will help people who have cognitive impairment with MS.
Can you talk a little bit about the research you were able to conduct with your team when it came to exercise, cognition, and MS?
Yeah, so over the past probably 10 years now, maybe a little longer than that, we were trying to figure out in a very unsexy manner of what works best. And we did that in a step-by-step way, where we first tried to figure out what domain of cognition might be most sensitive to exercise, what type of exercise might improve cognition the most, what profile of MS would probably respond to exercise training interventions the best, and then we tested it in a couple of small trials. We saw some improvements in cognition based on our early work. We also saw some improvements in brain function that correlated with our improvements in cognition, and now we're at the stage where we're trying to develop our program into a remotely delivered and supported approach so that people can do this on their own with a little bit of help from our behavior coaches at home. And they don't have to drive into our lab 3 days a week for 3 months to get benefits, but instead they can wear a Fitbit and they can walk a bunch on their own with a prescription, with a manual, and with some guidance via Zoom chatting with a behavior coach to really help themselves out.
What have you seen as a result of that research?
So far we've seen some really promising, exciting effects where our walking intervention was associated with a pretty large change in cognitive processing speed relative to our control condition, which was stretching and range of motion activities. We saw some benefits with that program too, but they weren't necessarily for cognition. So now we're in the process of designing larger trials to test to see whether or not this approach works in a larger, more representative sample of people with MS.
You know, one of the nice things about coming to a conference like this is I get to actually be face to face with some of the people I'd like to talk to. You're one of those people. I recognized about a month ago, I think, that you were actually the lead author of a paper that was published. And in that paper, you and your co-authors offered a new framework to help guide research into exercise and MS. Before we get to the framework itself, what was the impetus for publishing the paper?
That's funny. ECTRIMS, actually, and it was about 5 minutes before we ran into each other at ECTRIMS, where Professor Model gave a talk in a session that I was in that talked about this experimental medicine framework for a totally different purpose. And I said to him, why don't we publish a paper on this? This could really be helpful for moving the field forward. So there's all these efforts going on right now for exercise and MS and trying to figure out why exercise or how exercise improves outcomes in this population. And there just seems to be something missing to get the research really off the ground. And what we think that is a framework for what kinds of studies to do in what order in order to finally figure out the mechanism as to why, because that seems to be missing overall in the field.
So your framework, the framework outlined in your paper, I should say, involves a 4-step process. Can you take me through that process?
Sure. So that framework, you said it's a new framework. It's actually really old. It's been around since the 50s, but it just hasn't been applied in this area yet. And like you said, 4 different steps. The first step is identifying potential targets for exercise and function. So to do that, we would just think conceptually, okay, what area in the brain or what brain outcome would likely respond to exercise and would likely represent an underlying process for change in function, like walking or cognition or something along those lines. The second step is then to see whether or not those targets correlate with the functional outcomes that we think it will. And that's a pretty easy process of doing some cross-sectional research, like, for example, all the work done out of the University of Buffalo, where they look at thalamic correlates of cognitive processing speed. That would fall under that process. The third step is then to see if aspects of exercise, which would be physical activity or physical fitness, or even exercise itself, could change the target that we identified in step 1. Doing that would also involve some cross-sectional work, or it could involve a small-scale trial. And then the fourth step is to test the entire thing, to see if the effects of exercise on function are accounted for by changes in the brain. And there are some sophisticated analyses that we can do to see whether or not all the variability in change in the functional outcome is explained by changes in the brain. So that was really our paper, just to get the conversation started.
I think you've succeeded. I just want to say thanks for everything you do to improve the quality of life for people who are living with MS. It's always great talking to you. Thanks so much for stopping by.
And you as well, John. I mean, what you do is unbelievable for the MS community, particularly on World MS Day. So thank you for speaking with me today.
Over the past several years, there's been a tremendous amount of interest and curiosity around using cannabis to help manage MS symptoms. As cannabis has become legally available in large parts of the U.S. and throughout Canada, that interest has turned into action, as many people with MS are using cannabis, or at least trying cannabis, for symptom management. Like any other drug, cannabis offers both risks and rewards. But how do you assess those risks and rewards? Beyond anecdotal information, beyond opinion, what does the evidence show? Well, I can't think of anyone who has dedicated more time, energy, and resources to researching how cannabis impacts MS than Dr. Anthony Feinstein. Dr. Feinstein is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. His expertise is in the neuropsychiatry of multiple sclerosis, and Dr. Feinstein shared the evidence during his research update on the use and effectiveness of marijuana in MS. After his session, Dr. Feinstein and I talked about what he and his team have learned about how marijuana affects people with multiple sclerosis. I'm at the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting talking with Dr. Anthony Feinstein. Dr. Feinstein is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and his expertise is in the neuropsychiatry of multiple sclerosis. Today, I just listened to Dr. Feinstein's presentation on the impact of cannabis on cognition among people with MS and learned a lot. A number of interesting insights that I think are worth talking about. One of the comments I heard you make very early on is THC is injurious to people who use it.
Yeah, thanks, John. So we have done a number of studies looking at the effects of THC in particular on cognition in people with MS. And we've come up with a well-replicated finding that individuals who use THC regularly will have more cognitive deficits with respect to processing speed, memory, working memory, and executive functioning than people with MS who do not use cannabis. And that's an important observation because we know that just putting cannabis aside for a moment, there are high rates of cognitive dysfunction in MS to begin with, and now you're adding something to the mix that might even make those rates higher. And so this is something that people with MS need to be aware of because many people with MS do use cannabis. They report getting, many benefits from the drug. But like any medication or any drug, you need to know what are the downsides, what are the side effects. And I think impaired cognition is certainly one of those.
As you mentioned, you've done several studies. They started with a very small pilot study and have not only grown in terms of the sample size, but also in terms of the complexity of the studies themselves, where you're using imaging now to actually watch how the brain functions among people who are using cannabis versus those with MS who are not using cannabis. One of the things you pointed out today is that cannabis seemed to suppress neural activity in the thalamus. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that means?
So as part of our studies, we want to get a mechanistic understanding of what's going on. And so we've used some functional MRI paradigms to get a sense of how is a brain functioning during a task. So we've given individuals specific tasks relating to information processing speed. There we use a test called the single-digit modality test. We've also looked at working memory. There we use a task called the NBAC. What we found with the processing speed test was that individuals who smoked cannabis had far less activation within the thalamus compared to individuals who were not smoking cannabis. Now, it wasn't just the thalamic finding. There were other areas of the brain involved as well. So there's a well-defined neural network that we know underpins processing speed, but the thalamus is part of that. So it really was quite a dramatic finding. When we looked at things like working memory, we found a very similar picture. In other words, cannabis seems to suppress brain activation, which then hinders the person's ability to do the cognitive task. It also seems to limit their brain plasticity. In other words, as tasks become more complicated, the brain has to work harder to do it. When we see people off cannabis, we have a good map of how this complexity plays out in terms of brain activation. We see more activation taking place, even in the context of MS, although once again plasticity can be suppressed. When you bring in cannabis as part of it, you start seeing that plasticity falter. So as a task becomes more complex, the brain can't make the next step, and the activation starts decreasing.
Further studies have, or I should say a more expanded study, has also shown an impact on gray matter in the brain, white matter in the brain. Cannabis use seems to impact a whole gamut of cognitive-related skills or abilities.
Yeah, so the anatomical data was really interesting because there was no real difference between cannabis users and non-cannabis users in terms of gray matter volume or white matter volume or indeed even lesion volume. However, if you've got atrophy, whether it's gray matter or white matter, that atrophy becomes clinically more significant in the context of cannabis use. In other words, if you're a cannabis user with atrophy, you're more likely to show memory deficits than someone who has the same atrophy, but you're not using cannabis. So there's a vulnerability to the brain structurally as well in terms of cognition in the context of cannabis use.
And you've also looked at what happens when someone with MS who's using cannabis stops.
I think this is very encouraging. So we know that cannabis has got a long half-life. So if you stop using it, it lingers in the system for at least 28 days because it's lipophilic. So we did a study looking at people at baseline. They're all using cannabis. Half the sample discontinued cannabis. We followed the group for 28 days, repeated the cognitive measure at day 28, and we showed very dramatically that the group that's come off cannabis has a significant improvement in their processing speed, their working memory, their executive functioning, their verbal fluency, etc. The group that remains on cannabis does not show that improvement. Indeed, the group that stays on cannabis doesn't even show a practice effect. We know that people get better with practice. In the context of cannabis, you don't see the practice effect. When you come off cannabis, you certainly see the benefits by day 28 in terms of much improved cognition.
I want to circle back to those people who come off cannabis in just a moment, but you also discovered that there seem to be sex-related differences amongst people who are using cannabis who are living with MS.
I mean, this is new work that we're doing, and it's preliminary. We need to go back and look at our data, and our sample size is small, but we know within the MS field, the male brain is more vulnerable from a cognitive perspective, that men have more cognitive deficits than women, particularly things like memory, maybe in processing speed. We certainly see that in our MS samples of cannabis, but when they start using cannabis, those sex differences disappear. We don't see the memory differences between the two sexes, almost as cannabis wipes out whatever protective factor women have in terms of their cognition. When they stop using cannabis, the bounce back is more prominent in women. In other words, their cognition improves more than it does, and you start seeing the sex differences starting to come out again. So it's an intriguing observation. We have to go back and look at our data more carefully. We want to have a look at some of the imaging correlates of that to see whether clues as to what's going on. But one more interesting thing to look at, because the sex finding has been around for quite some time, and cannabis seems to neutralize that.
I said I wanted to go back and talk again about the studies you've done that have had people stop cannabis for a period of 28 days and experience, I shouldn't say they experienced it, I'll say they showed cognitive improvement across the board. And so at the end of the study, you and your team sat down with these folks individually and pointed that out to them, that they had experienced this benefit.
Well, we did two things. We sat down and showed them how their cognition had improved. And the improvement was across multiple domains. It wasn't just a single cognitive, their memory was better, their processing speed was faster, their executive functioning was better. We also showed them the group data in terms of brain imaging, how the brain networks are healthier off cannabis, how the activation that had been suppressed by cannabis use starts returning, which can explain why their cognition improves. So it makes a very compelling picture. You've got the cognitive results in front of you on the one hand, you've got the imaging picture on the other, you put the two together, there's your mechanistic understanding of what's going on. To our great surprise, our patients listened very carefully to it, but to a man and woman, they all went back onto cannabis use. They all wanted to go back to using cannabis. And the question is why? And we don't really know because it wasn't part of our initial methodology. But it's a very important clinical question, obviously. It's one that we have to try and understand. We have some indirect clues as to why that might be. So in our original methodology, we had a number of patient-report outcomes, one of which was the Modified Fatigue Impact Scale. And there are subscales to that, one of which is the cognitive subscale, in which we get patients to rate their own cognitive abilities. These are people with MS telling us how they perceive their own cognition across a number of different questionnaires. And when we analyzed this data in the group that stayed on cannabis and the group that came off, essentially there was no difference between the two groups. The group that came off cannabis was unable to appreciate that their cognition had improved. They were not aware, or they couldn't feel that their cognition was in a better place. So to them, things were still the same. I stopped taking cannabis, but nothing had really changed in my life. In fact, there was one small positive benefit for them. The group that came off cannabis felt a little bit more socially anxious than the group that stayed on it, which I think can be, an important reason why people use it. even though they're not telling you they're using it for that reason. But in terms of the person's ability to appreciate their own cognition, and that's something called metacognition, which we know is faulty in people with MS, the individuals who came off cannabis were unaware or unable to appreciate that so many aspects of their cognition had improved. And I think that may be one of the reasons why they go back on it. They feel socially a bit more anxious. They're not aware of any cognitive benefits. So, hey, I'll go back on the drug.
So this meeting really brings together a variety of different kinds of healthcare providers, everyone from neurologists to nurse practitioners to MS nurses, a variety of folks. And I guess the big question after hearing your talk is, what is it that they should be telling their patients? What are you recommending?
So I think like any drug, you've got to work out what are the benefits and what are the risks, what are the side effects, what are the pros and cons. And the same is true for cannabis. And because cannabis is relatively new, we don't have a full appreciation of the risks and benefits. What I can tell my patients is that we've done a number of studies that show that cannabis THC, it's very important, not the CBD component, the THC is potentially injurious to their cognition. And we tell them it's not just one study, but it's a whole series of studies. And we've got brain imaging data to suggest why that might be. And so when you start using cannabis, just be aware that the drug might help you. You may find that it's giving you certain benefits. Listen very carefully to what those are. But at the same time, there's a very good chance that it's going to impair your cognition. We also tell them that if you stop using cannabis, there's a very good chance that your cognition will improve significantly, because we've shown that. So we're just trying to educate our patients as to what is cannabis? What does it do? What might it not do? How might it harm me? But this is a journey of discovery for all of us, because there's so little data out there. This is one lab with one story. I would love other labs to be able to replicate this or maybe refute it, because that's the next step.
As you pointed out, we're talking about THC and not CBD. There was something else you pointed out that is probably worth mentioning as well. This is not your grandfather's cannabis. You pointed out that the cannabis available today, you categorized it as a designer drug, quite different from the cannabis that might have been available in college dormitories in the 1970s.
Absolutely. It's much, much more potent. There's good data to show that. There's compelling data from the province that I work in, the province of Ontario in Canada, that the drug that's out on the street is far more potent than the drug that was back there, a decade or two back. And so that also comes with implications for, side effects. We haven't even spoken about psychosis, which I think is a big issue in the vulnerable brain. We don't see that in people with MS. I haven't seen a lot of psychosis in my cannabis users, but the real concern is cognition.
Dr. Feinstein, every time I talk to you, I learn something new. Thank you so much for all you do to improve the lives of not only the people you care for in Toronto, but everybody who gets to hear and read your findings. Thanks again for talking with me.
My pleasure, John. Thanks for your interest.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society, and you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/354. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. I hope you'll join me next week when my guest will be the Managing Director of the North American Research Committee on Multiple Sclerosis, Dr. Robert Fox. Dr. Fox and I will be doing a deep dive into the NARCOMS patient registry. You'll find out what that is and why you might want to consider being a part of it. Meanwhile, if you have a minute, I hope you'll pay a visit to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.